Great. Well, thank you, Julia, for that great capsule history of my life. And great to see old friends and new friends in the audience. Thanks, everyone, for turning out today. As Julia described, I have been working for the past 13 years at the World Economic Forum, which is an international organization that facilitates public-private collaboration and multi-stakeholder collaboration on major global issues. And when I arrived at the forum, I had a passion for mobilizing the private sector to address hunger issues. And I had no idea how we could do that. I just knew I wanted to do it. And at that point, the forum had never worked on these issues before. There was one company that was interested, and no one had even mapped out what can the private sector do on these issues. So we were really starting from zero. But thanks to a lot of very impassioned leaders, this grew to be a really thriving and very unique and interesting program of the forum, and became actually one of the largest, most action-oriented programs of the forum. So I'd like to share with you today a little bit of that journey, but also to share with you some of the big picture things that we learned along the way, and some of the issues and insights that we have discussed with global leaders, even up to 2 or 3 weeks ago in Davos. So just a quick overview of what we're going to try to cover today, and leave time for discussion. A quick snapshot of the current state of food systems, which is not good. Our goals for what food systems should be, which are pretty clear. Scenarios for what the future could look like, which range from inspiring to alarming. And then a lot of solutions. How can we fix some of the myriad really tough issues in the global food system? And most importantly, what can all of you do as Stanford students and members of the Stanford community in tackling some of these issues from either at home or in your professional careers? So first, a quick snapshot of the state of the food system. If the world's food systems were Stanford students, they would be flunking out of school. The food systems are really in an unsustainable and unhealthy state. In terms of providing sustenance to the world, we have 850 million people who are hungry. That number is rising for the first time in a decade because of conflict and climate change. 2 billion people with micronutrient deficiencies and 2 billion adults who are obese. That means that more than half the world's population is not receiving the right balance of nutrition. In terms of providing livelihoods, 800 million people that depend on agriculture live below the poverty line. Environmental sustainability, I think people are quite aware that agriculture is the largest driver of deforestation. It's responsible either directly or indirectly for up to 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. And agriculture uses 70% of the freshwater withdrawals that are made by humans. So enormous environmental impact. It's also a very inefficient system. 30 to 40% of the food that is produced is lost on the production end or wasted on the consumption end. And so overall, a pretty dysfunctional system, which is serving some people on Earth, but not others. Many, many issues in there that need to be fixed. What is a real cause for concern is that by 2050, when we have 9 billion people on Earth, we're going to need to be producing 60% more food than is currently being consumed today. And you can see from some of these numbers, it's not possible to double or increase some of the impacts that are now happening. So this is business as usual is basically not an option for feeding those 9 billion people. What this shows us is that we need not specific fixes, but really a full-scale transformation of the food system. One of the barriers to fixing a lot of the problems in the food system is its complexity. You can see in the dark blue line there just the core value chain of producing food from the time a farmer first gets an idea, tries to take out a loan, buy some inputs, get the right information, the right labor, the right machinery to put the crops in the ground and have information at the right time. That's already about 10 to 15 steps. If you follow all those steps all the way to the food actually being served to you on your plate, it's a very complex value chain. It depends by region and by commodity, but in general, it's quite complex. This value chain also depends upon a lot of enablers, whether that's the transportation system, you need energy, you need functioning markets, you need effective policy, environmental resource management. So there's a lot of elements of the enabling environment around that core food production system that are also add many layers of complexity. And you can imagine between all those steps to produce food and all of those different enablers, there's many different organizations that are involved in this system. And so what we call the stakeholder landscape is very complex as well. If you're even just thinking about business, there's more than 10 industries that are involved in the food system. And then you have government, civil society, farmers associations, donors and international organizations, research and academia. It's quite a crowd of stakeholders who are normally not really coordinating together in a holistic manner. It's fairly transactional. So we see, in general, a system that is very complex and also very fragmented. And that makes it difficult to solve some of the larger systemic problems. What is encouraging, though, is that there is a lot of agreement and alignment about what people would like the food system to be. So the aspirations for what everyone wants our food system to be like are pretty clear. It should be inclusive, it should be feeding everyone, providing sustainable livelihoods. It should be sustainable for the planet. It should be efficient to make good use of the resources that it does use. And it should be nutritious. We know that nutrition is incredibly important, not only for human health, but also it has an economic impact as well. A child that is poorly nourished in their early years can end up with cognitive deficits that leave them with lifelong health problems and also reduce their earning potential. And that has an economic impact as well. So all of these elements are part of the aspiration that we've heard over many years, over dialogues with thousands of leaders, that everyone fully agrees where we should be going. The tough part is how to get there. And so these aspirations are reflected very much in the Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted in 2016. The second Sustainable Development Goal makes a very ambitious and bold call to end hunger, to achieve food security and improve nutrition, and to promote sustainable agriculture. The SDGs also recognize that all of the goals are interconnected, so every single one of them influences the food system and is influenced by the food system. So, of course, I'm a little bit biased, but I feel, and many of us that work on these issues feel that the food system is really central to meeting many of the Sustainable Development Goals that the world has committed to. So when the SDGs were adopted, there was a bit of a celebratory air at the World Economic Forum's meeting of global leaders in Davos and in the international community as a whole. And on our side, we became a little concerned that the global leaders that were involved in the food system were not seeing the urgency enough. We weren't seeing that sense of urgency. And so we decided to try to shock them into a little bit more motivation by developing some scenarios for the future of the food system to illustrate some different directions that the food systems could go in the coming years. And just for curiosity, how many people in the room are familiar with scenario planning or the concept of scenarios? Great, okay, lots of scenarios experts, that's great. So just to give a quick recap, these types of scenarios are not scientific predictions. They're more like stories about possible futures, which are intended to stimulate our thinking, to get us out of this sort of default future that many of us have in our mind when we assume that the future will be the same as today with incremental change. And then we're surprised when something different happens. So the purpose of scenarios is to force us to think, what if this happened? What if this happened? And what does that mean that we should be doing today? For the scenarios that we built about the future of food systems, the main guiding question that we had was, how will food systems nutritiously and sustainably feed 8.5 billion people by 2030? That's the time frame for the Sustainable Development Goals. And the way that you create scenarios, as many of you know, is to identify the two greatest uncertainties that will drive the future around this question. So we consulted with more than 100 experts and stakeholders in this process. Everyone agreed that the biggest uncertainty is the future shape of consumer demand. So as the world scales up to 9 billion people, will everyone be eating steak and drinking wine and having processed foods, or will that consumer demand shift to really demand sustainably produced and nutritious foods. That will have an enormous downstream impact on what the food system looks like in the future. So consumer demand was the main uncertainty driver. The other one, there was a big debate about what the second uncertainty should be. And what all of these experts agreed was that the second biggest uncertainty in this 12-year time frame that lies ahead of us from here to 2030 is market connectivity. That means the functionality of markets, the openness of trade, the ability for information and innovation to flow across borders. And honestly, that was a little bit of a surprise to me. I said, what about climate change? And they said, climate change is not an uncertainty. So we're just going to assume in this scenarios process that climate change is going to be happening. I said, what about technology innovation? And they said, well, the large-scale impacts of that are more likely to be seen on a really global scale beyond 2030. We'll see about that one. But these were our two major uncertainties. So when you put those together in a matrix, you get 4 different scenarios. Each one has a catchy title and an intriguing or disturbing story behind it. So I'd like to just give you a little snapshot of each of those 4 scenarios, and would love to hear your reaction. And I think will these slides be available afterwards? So for those of you that would like these slides, I know I'm flying through a lot of material quickly, so you're welcome to get these from the sustainability program later. So the first scenario that we'll look at is based on resource-intensive consumption patterns and low market connectivity. So you have fragmented markets, and that leaves some countries or some regions able to produce food and have a lot of productivity and be self-sufficient and have a very high, although unsustainable, rate of consumption. Others are left behind. So here you see the rich people in the bubble and the poor and others that suffering from climate change left outside. So in this type of scenario, you would see an increase in poverty, hunger, conflict, migration, a very dramatic increase in inequality, the haves versus the have-nots, probably increased efforts for land grabs and sort of a colonization 2.0 as people try to seize and get control of resources in order to ensure their food security, and a great distrust in globalization, of fragmentation and volatility in the markets. It's quite a bleak picture. But this is, there are elements of this that we can see in our reality today. And in fact, all 4 scenarios, we can see elements of those at work in the world today. So that inequality and fragmentation is really at the core of the survival of the richest scenario. The next scenario is called unchecked consumption, and that's where you have unsustainable consumption and high market connectivity. So very high growth with a very high environmental and health impact. Markets are booming, yields are increasing, but at the same time, obesity and health costs are skyrocketing and natural resources are being depleted. So this is really sort of a high consumption lifestyle on steroids. We had one CEO of a global food company point at this scenario and say, this is the reality of the United States today. So there are some aspects of that we can definitely see in this country as well as in others, but also some more hopeful ones as well. The third scenario is everyone's favorite. This is the one where we have resource-efficient consumption, demand from consumers, and high market connectivity. So in this scenario, consumers are demanding sustainable and nutritious foods, and you have a market system and an enabling environment which is able to respond to that with transparency in value chains, with new innovation for more sustainable production, with personalized nutrition, a lot of collaboration across borders, growing trust and openness, and a transformation and revitalization of rural areas. Of course, it's not 100% positive. As this system transforms into this scenario, some people would be left behind. But this is by far the most positive one among the 4. The last one is called Local is the New Global. I used to call this the Vermont scenario because it reminded me of Vermont, where I spent a lot of time growing up, where there's a lot of small farms and local production. There's resource-efficient consumption, but low market connectivity. So again, you have the fragmentation among areas. For those that are able to be self-sufficient and innovative, you would have these islands of sustainable, nutritious food systems, but others are left behind. And so there's an increase in hunger hotspots, even as you have sustainability role models also happening. Also, a lot of innovation can happen in this scenario, but it's not able to scale across countries or regions because of that fragmentation. So these are just 4 quick snapshots of different scenarios that we might face in the future with our food system. I think, as you'll see, a lot of them are visible in the world that we have today. The question is, which one will grow to dominate? And so the purpose of the scenarios is really to invite reflection for us to think about what kind of food system do we want to have in the future? Are we on the right track to reach it? If we all like that positive scenario, how do we get there? What are the actions and decisions that we should be taking today in order to make that happen? So with all of these, the current state of food systems and the potential futures, you might be thinking, this sounds slightly alarming, and what can I do about it? Well, there's a lot that you can do as students and as members of the Stanford community. We definitely need new talent and more troops to join the fight. So really would encourage anyone to dive into these issues if you have an interest. On a personal or family level, of course, you can be a smart consumer. Think about the impact of what you're buying, what you're choosing, because as you've seen, that consumer demand will be the biggest driver, and everybody's choices add up. So your choices, both for yourself and for the planet, do make a difference. You can also be an active citizen to lobby your government to put the policies in place that will incentivize sustainable and nutritious food systems. If you're looking for something to do with your time, you can tackle one of the big issues in the food system, and there's some real opportunities for progress that we'll look at next. Or you can dive into the Silicon Valley or other innovation regions to help disrupt and transform the food system through technology innovation. And we have some new thoughts about that as well. So I'm just going to share with you a couple of things that we have presented and discussed with global leaders in Davos a few weeks ago and in the past couple of years, and would love to hear your feedback in the discussion. So one is, you can see from all of the problems in the food system and all of the complexity in the food system, there's a very long list of issues that need to be fixed. And it can be a little bit overwhelming at times. It really is a very long list. What we did is to try to do a scan and an overview and identify the 12 opportunities for large-scale progress that could make a big impact. So these are the sort of big targets for change. These 12 things represent not only problems, but also real opportunities. So for example, most smallholder farmers and a lot of small and medium enterprises, particularly in the developing world, don't have access to financial services or to markets to sell their goods. And solving that problem, there's a $400 billion in unmet demand for financial services from smallholder farmers alone. So that's a real business opportunity. And there's a number of really interesting innovators that are working on that, but it has yet to be solved on a large scale. Empowering women. So if women had, I know this is close to the heart of some friends in the audience, if women had the same access to agricultural extension, financial services, land rights, and even just physical food in the home as men, that would reduce the number of hungry people by 140 million. So women's empowerment is hugely impactful within food systems. Improving land and forest management, reducing food loss and waste. There's a lot of value that's currently being lost in the food system because of environmental degradation, because of that loss and waste along the value chain. And so finding solutions to that also represents a business opportunity as well as a social and environmental opportunity. And then improving consumer diets. So I mentioned earlier malnutrition and the impact on both children and economies. For countries that have a very heavy burden of malnutrition, solving that problem could increase their GDP by up to 5%. So these are all tough problems, but solving them will bring really significant progress, both for the food system and for larger issues in the world. So very much encourage you to dive into any of those. Let's talk about innovation for a moment. Over the past year, we took a look at what's happening with technology innovation in the food system. And we found that this sector is lagging far behind others. Working with McKinsey, we did a scan to look for investments in startups related to the food system, anytime from now back till 2010. And we found $14 billion of investment in 1,000 startups. It's really not that much, particularly when you compare it to what's been going on in health, where we had found $145 billion of investment in 18,000 startups. So a lot of the exciting emerging technology innovations that are happening related to the food system are in a very early stage and have yet to go to scale. But as we can see, those have a potential to solve some really big problems. So looking at across the whole food system from the consumer side over to the production side, we looked at what are some of the exciting technologies that are emerging in the food system. We came up with what we call the transformative 12. We have a full report on this at a web link that I'll share with you at the end. But 12 really interesting technology innovations that have a potential to go to a larger scale. And we actually tried to crunch some numbers to get a sense of what could be the impact of these innovations on greenhouse gas emissions, water use, nutrition, food loss and waste. So seeing what's their potential for actually solving some of the big problems in the food system. And these ones all we felt had a lot of really significant potential. So number one, alternative proteins is one of the most impactful for the environment. If alternative proteins, whether it's plant-based alternatives, a few weeks ago in Davos, we were serving Impossible burgers to all the world leaders. Those were developed by a former Stanford professor. Alternatives like that, or sort of lab-grown meat, using insect-based protein to feed animals, all of that can really lower the environmental impact of producing protein. And if that went to scale, we would see a reduction in 950 megatons of greenhouse gases, 400 billion cubic meters of water, 400 million hectares of land use. So really significant impacts that can come from that. Mobile-based service delivery is a very impactful one for a smallholder farmer's income, which could be increased by $200 billion per year, as well as bringing more sustainability to their efforts. Things like the Internet of Things and blockchain can bring not only a lot more transparency and efficiency to the supply chain, but also reduce loss and waste very significantly. Precision agriculture is one that can really boost food production, which is something that we have to do to meet that growing population, while also reducing water use and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and also reducing the cost of farming to farmers. So a lot of these on the consumer side, the value chain side, and the production side have really significant potential. But as we saw, they're in an early stage. So this also, in terms of innovation for food systems, is something we would really encourage all of you to dive into. Now, even with the best technology or the best solution, usually one organization can't solve the problems in the food system by themselves. And that's where the whole approach of partnering comes in. And at the World Economic Forum, that was actually our specialty. What we really focused on was bringing together very diverse parties, brokering and facilitating partnerships for them to work together, pool their different talents, their different assets and resources to work together more effectively. So we had something called the New Vision for Agriculture Initiative, which is still thriving and growing at the World Economic Forum, involving 650 organizations that were mobilized into action in 21 countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and have mobilized billions of dollars of investment benefiting millions of farmers. This was a really fantastic and really was at the heart of our work at the forum over the past decade. And one thing that I want to really highlight is the partnership principles that you see there. We really put the countries that were leading these efforts at the center. And our role as a global organization was to help mobilize the support and the expertise and the resources that were needed to help local leaders achieve their own goals. And so that country-led, locally owned aspect of these action-oriented partnerships, which happened everywhere from Indonesia to India to Colombia to Tanzania, those were really locally owned and led. And our role was to be a facilitator and mobilizer and connector. And so building those types of partnership, which takes time, takes an effort to build trust, to help people realize they share the same goal, to commit to working together, and then to learn how to work together effectively, is a very important part of the process in trying to bring together those fragmented stakeholders in the food system to work together effectively. Once this initiative had grown to 21 countries, we realized that it had become something bigger. There was demand from many more countries who wanted to take this approach. We just didn't have the ability to support them. And so we developed a guide to doing these types of partnerships, but we also worked with the Harvard Kennedy School to do a case study of this initiative to see what we could learn from it that could be useful to others. And we were really intrigued and surprised when the Harvard team came back to us and said, we think this initiative is a great example of system leadership. So how many people here are familiar with the term system leadership? So some experts over on the side. So the idea behind system leadership is that if you want to create change in a complex system, it requires a different set of tools and tactics than if you were in a more traditional hierarchical top-down system. So if you're in the military or a corporation or a government department, you have someone with clear authority at the top who can issue an order and people will carry it out, and that's how you can create change. But if you're trying to solve climate change or the food system, there's a huge number of incredibly diverse actors. Nobody is in charge. A lot of these actors are not talking to each other, or they don't trust each other, or they are skeptical of each other. How do you mobilize them all in the same direction? And that's really the heart of what system leadership is about. It's the idea that you need to build trust, to build alignment, and then to sort of orchestrate and galvanize action and empower people to independently take action, to collaborate with each other, and to all move collectively towards this larger goal. So that's the concept of system leadership, which I encourage you to explore more. We also have the report on that on our web link. And I would also emphasize that anybody can be a system leader. You don't have to have authority. You just have to be a member, a participant in the system. So action can start from anywhere, and ideas can be launched from anywhere in this system leadership scenario. And this is something that I'm really intrigued by and have been talking a lot with Julia, with other collaborators at Stanford about to see if we can look into this a bit further. So that was a flying tour through quite a lot of big picture overviews of where we stand on food security and the food system and what some of the solutions may be. I would love to hear now, just to open it up to comments and questions and have a further discussion. So the floor is open to anyone who has a question. Yes?
Was there any discussion to see the impacts of the, say, local farmers on the alternative proteins development?
That's a great question. So the question is, have we had discussions about the impact of alternative proteins on small farmers in particular? That's a really great question. So on our side, in terms of the work the World Economic Forum has been doing, we have just started getting involved in this conversation about technology innovation and particularly alternative proteins. There was a big discussion about it in Davos just a few weeks ago. And that issue is very important because there are a lot of smallholder farmers that depend on small-scale livestock production for their livelihoods. And so as some of these new technologies come on board, there are big shifts and winners and losers in those shifts. And so I think, we've also seen people from regions that really prioritize cattle production having a very strong emotional response to this technology. So I think that the alternative proteins are not going to take over the world tomorrow. It will probably be a gradual process of certain regions and certain markets adopting those. And I think the most likely, and what we heard in Davos was sort of the most likely outcome is to have a mixed system. So we're not talking about wiping out animal production completely, but also not scaling it up in the future. So managing or reducing the environmental impacts of that animal production in a way that smallholder farmers still can have that livelihood. So, any others? Yes.
I find with farmers, there's a lot of these tools, technology, are disruptive, and at the farmers' level, they're very set in their ways to enhance the process. Is there a discussion at Davos about how to engage more with the educational and interactive approach, like little mini school systems to not just educate them in the process, but also the social economic systems to enhance their lifestyle?
Yeah. A lot of the farmers associations that we work with, and then UN organizations, including EFAD and others, are definitely working with farmers on, and as well as the CGIAR system and others, on adopting new practices. So that's something that comes into the discussions, was not necessarily a big focus, but that's definitely a big part of the reality of implementing change on the ground. Yes.
Thank you for your talk, for one, and on a similar note, but on a different side of the supply chain, I know one of the uncertainty points that you mentioned was the demand that people might have for this, sustainable supply chain, especially in food. And I'm curious if, for one, in a place like Palo Alto, you see that all over the place, in the Bay Area especially, but they're often more expensive goods, and it's not something that people want all over the place. So I'm curious if you see kind of a price shift in making that more available to consumers from all types of economic backgrounds, and also a demand for it in other parts of the country or the world.
Yeah. So the question is, I guess, sustainable and nutritious products often cost more. So how can we address that problem and make it more accessible for people that don't have that kind of budget? And that's a great question, and I think that it's sort of an ongoing experiment in the U.S. to see now that there's really interesting increase in demand for sustainable and nutritious products, to see how the market is responding to that, and to see companies like Walmart, for example, now becoming the biggest retailer of organic food, and helping to both raise the volume of production and push the cost down. So for some of these new innovations, creating new products, I think that needs to be a very important consideration as well. Others? Yes?
Can you speak at all about the government or regulations and policies that can either be implemented to help speed along some of these, or some of the issues that might be confronted with, for example, clean meat or all the rest of it, and how you see those shaking out over time?
So the question is government policies that can help speed up, and do you mean particularly those technology innovations?
Yeah, either like ways that policies that should be implemented that would help speed this up, or also potential drawbacks of issues with FDA approval of some of these new technologies, and how you kind of see some of that working out.
Yeah. Great. So the question is what policies work, and also what policies or regulations or lack thereof can be a barrier. And that's a great question. I mean, we see over and over again that policy is one of the biggest determinants of what happens in the food system. And there is not a very good approach to understanding and sharing best practice for effective policies across countries and across regions. And so there's a lot of examples of policies that have worked, and they're really not shared and adopted widely enough. So that's a huge need that we have to work more with government leaders and with regulators to understand the policy approaches that work. And my focus has been particularly in developing countries where governments often do need that type of technical support to understand the policy options that they could apply. or to share with others really innovative policy that is piloted in their country. Your question about the sort of regulation of new technologies, I think, is a really great one, because we're seeing that regulators are scrambling to keep up and really failing to keep up with the pace of innovation, particularly in other sectors. It's more evident. But even the Impossible Burger has run into regulatory issues because the FDA doesn't really know how to classify it. And so that's definitely an issue both in this sector and in others. Yes.
Hi. This is a very insightful and unique way of looking at the problem. And I think being from India and having worked in Africa, do you think this is going to solve the problem? Because at least in some of these geographies and cultures, people look up to somebody for leadership. And when you're looking at systemic leadership, and when there are multiple conflicting interests, at the same time when US is leaving the baton on leadership. So how do you think this is going to play out in the next few years? And are we going to solve the issues or not?
Well, I'm not sure if I can predict. I certainly hope so. So the question is, are you talking particularly about the system leadership approach, or just all of these solutions that we've talked about?
The solutions are great. I'm wondering about how do we use systemic leadership, apply them in Indian and African and Southeast Asian cultural context, and get the same results.
Great question. So the question is, how can we apply the system leadership approach, particularly in places like India, Africa, and Southeast Asia, I think. In introducing the idea of system leadership, I'm not saying that the whole world should convert to nothing but system leadership. There's definitely a place for structured hierarchical leadership, particularly of organizations or particularly in organizations. But system leadership is an idea to solve the problem of how to create collective action on a complex problem. And we actually found that we worked extensively with stakeholders in India, throughout Africa, Southeast Asia, and they were very open to this idea. So we're not taking away their authority or challenging their authority. We're helping them to work more effectively with others and helping them to solve a problem that they can't solve alone. So I think if it's presented as a solution and a tool in the toolkit that will complement and enhance the goals that a particular leader or organization has, then it can be very complementary.
Maybe
Yes.
I could just add a thought to that and then ask a question. I think one of the things we look at in our program too is the world working in such complexity now and dynamism, where there's such interrelationship, whether it's because of globalization or the interaction between human beings and the natural environment. We're living in dynamic, complex systems. And so hierarchical leadership, there may be a place for it, but even generally speaking, when you're dealing with complex dynamic systems, that can be too rigid. You need a highly adaptable systems for managing and leading, because you need peripheral engagement to understand what's happening at the periphery, and if you have things too centrally structured, then you often eliminate the opportunity for information to flow and inform good decisions, whereas if you empower the periphery to sense change and act on it, and you can do that in a coordinated way, I mean, that can be a more effective way to deal with the kind of complexity we're dealing with today. Mm-hmm. So I think we may need to evolve some of our cultural practices wherever they are, including plenty in the North America and other places where we're again we fall back on this hierarchical leadership. It may not suit us so well in our current context. But the question I had for you was, I'd love to hear maybe just a story or two of a particular project you worked on, or a group of people you engaged with, or a policy. You mentioned some policies do seem to work effectively. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a story or two of times where you felt most, I guess it's a little bit to your question, but not all the way in terms of, can we solve this? But where did you start seeing real seeds of transformation and getting a glimmer of hope that this really was transformative progress that you were witnessing in your engagement with one community or another, or a policy framework somewhere?
Great. Well, I have lots of stories to tell, probably not enough time to tell any of them, but maybe just honing in on the question of that feeling of transformation. We, through the course of a decade in working with thousands of leaders at the global, regional, and national level, we really had the opportunity and privilege to engage with some amazing people. And what was most inspiring about that was the leaders who really went out on a limb and made a personal commitment to drive change. And one of the first one that actually catalyzed the entire New Vision for Agriculture initiative was the president of Tanzania, the former president of Tanzania, Jakaya Kikwete, who joined some of our dialogues in Davos, said, I want the private sector to come help us transform agriculture in Tanzania. World Economic Forum, can you help us? And so we supported Tanzanian stakeholders who had already developed their own vision and plan for change in Tanzania to come together with a lot of global partners. We had meetings with hundreds of people in them in the beginning, with the president literally sort of giving orders and moderating from his table. To create a totally new conversation about agriculture in Tanzania with global partners. And what that big, rambunctious group decided to do was to focus in on one particular area of the country that had very high agricultural potential and was very undeveloped. And so they mobilized a significant amount of investment, built infrastructure, and the partnership approach that we helped to pilot there was institutionalized into an organization that's supported by the government and by global partners, whose role is for the next decade to facilitate partnerships and development of this particular region of Tanzania. So that was one example of a really committed visionary leader who went on an adventure with us where we had no idea where it was going to go and has created a real impact in his country. And what was interesting also about that type of journey, when that particular president, having stepped down from his office, spoke at one of our events last year, that was the story that he chose to speak about. So it had a big impact on him personally, and we saw that through this process of people's minds being opened to realize that other stakeholders that they had previously distrusted actually shared the same goal and could help them reach that goal. We found that there was a personal transformation in some of these leaders as they went through that process. And so that also is an aspect of system leadership that is really, really interesting. So, yes.
Thank you for your presentation. It's been very interesting. Kind of going off that point, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit towards how you work with leaders of multinational companies to realize kind of the economic but also social value and really convince them to make this commitment. I know you mentioned the example of Walmart, so I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about those interactions and how you've been able to convince these large organizations to have this impact.
Great question. So the question is, how do we work with large companies to get them engaged and committed on these issues? And I went through a really interesting personal journey on that front. I joined the World Economic Forum with a non-business background and was always interested in the private sector, but didn't have a direct experience dealing with business leaders. So the first meetings and dialogues that I organized had titles like, Join the Fight Against Hunger. And the CEOs were like, I don't think that's the meeting for me. So we changed the title to Invest in Agriculture. And they were like, oh yeah, sure, let's have this conversation. So part of it for me, that is a sort of reflects a larger dynamic where we had to learn how to speak the language of business, to understand their priorities and mindset, their motivations and incentives, and appeal to those to engage them in the issue. And that holds for the broader stakeholder landscape as well. We had similarly at the World Economic Forum people with a business background who had to learn how to understand and speak to and engage with governments. So for the very diverse organizations that are involved in these issues, you need to understand where they're coming from, what they can contribute to the issue, and then try to engage them on their terms to then start learning where others are coming from. On the bigger picture of engaging the private sector on this issue, I mentioned that 13 years ago there was very little happening with the private sector in this sector. Now there's so much happening that all these big initiatives have to have coordination meetings, which is a great problem to have. So there's a lot more activity now. But I am seeing that a lot of that activity focuses around a relatively small portion of the private sector who are sort of the best actors. So the Unilevers of the world and others that are very sophisticated, very committed to sustainability issues, very strong global citizens. And large amounts of the private sector, particularly national level companies and particularly in developing countries, local firms, are not involved in this conversation and are not really engaging. And so I think it's important for those that are working on these issues, instead of everyone fighting for access to Unilever and Walmart, to look more broadly at the companies that are not engaged and think about how to involve them as well, and particularly on a local level. Yes.
I have a couple questions, very different topics, but the first would be returning to the issue of reducing meat consumption. So I guess one interesting, two ways to look at it is one, reducing individual meat consumption, and then the other is reducing how much meat is produced. And there's like a tension between whether producers will respond to the changes in meat consumption. So what do you think is like feasible as a method of approaching this problem?
So the question is, to reduce meat consumption, should we work on the supply side or the demand side, basically?
Yeah.
So
how much do
consumer side
producers
or
respond to changes in
Yeah.
the market's demand?
I mean, in general, I think it's a demand-driven system. So if the demand changes, the market will shift as well. In certain countries, and based on cultural factors and preferences, that demand may be very slow to shift. So Argentina is not going to be vegan anytime soon, but others might be. So, yeah.
And then my second question was that for your transformative 12, I noticed that they were fairly high-tech based examples that you used. And using an analogy in architecture for sustainable design, there's passive building design, which will use like the orientation of a building to make sure that it gets like maximum sunlight when it's cold and minimum sunlight when it's warm. And then there's, when that's done, then you can reduce the energy demands, and so you need like less solar panels. And so I was just wondering, do you have some examples of prospective low-tech system transformations?
Yeah, I mean, the work that we did, that's a great point. So the question is the Transformative 12 focus on high-tech, new innovations, and what about the low-tech ones? And those are also very, very important. That wasn't in the scope of what we were doing, but hugely important, particularly for small-scale water pumps and other solutions that can make a really big difference for smallholder farmers and be a lot more accessible cost-wise. Sorry, I have to move on to others, but I'm happy to chat afterwards as well. I also just want to mention that in all of our discussions in Davos with very dynamic global leaders, there was one particular amazing woman global leader that stood out, who is actually in the room today. And although she did not necessarily want to speak, I wanted to recognize Earthren Cousin, who is a distinguished senior fellow at Stanford this year. She's the former head of the UN World Food Program, was really on the front lines of fighting hunger for the United Nations. And I would love to hear anything that you would love to share with us or any comments you might have.
I said to you when we spoke, this is your show. No, I think the things that you're talking about now are exactly the issues that need to be addressed, because I think the what you haven't spoken to in systems thinking is how do we scale up. That is one of the biggest challenges that we have, is that we see progress with using system design and in making transformations in food systems in particular areas. Tanzania is a great example of that. But you're working with 200,000 farmers, most. On average, it's about 25,000. We have 100 million smallholder farmers in sub-Saharan Africa and 500 million in the world. So what is it, what do you see from the work that you have done in the past that would help us scale up some of these programs that work.
Yeah, great point. So the question is, how do we really take some of these solutions to scale? Because that's what's missing. And honestly, I don't have a good answer. We were grappling with that same dilemma. So really promising solutions. I think technology can help scale them beyond borders. And we're definitely trying to sort of mobilize innovators and leaders towards large-scale solutions. But I think everyone is really asking the same question about how do we really create that large-scale progress and rapid shifts into a better system. So, yes. Sorry, last question.
Yeah. Would there be any worry about taking on too much, even with a group approach, and trying to tackle the whole food system that has all these different, very different components?
Great question. So the question is, taking the system leadership approach, can you get completely overloaded by trying to address everything in the food system? And absolutely yes. And that's a really common problem for groups of stakeholders that start working together to try to solve everything under the universe or take on too much. Usually they go through a process where they take on too much, they get overwhelmed, they have a crisis, and then they narrow down their focus. So once you've been through that cycle a time or two, you can suggest from the beginning that people have a more focused approach. But it's a tough balance because you want to keep the whole picture in mind, but then make a more focused impact. So
this may be related to that particular topic, but going back to the Tanzanian example, it sounds like it was a mixture of top-down management and systems management.
yes.
And I'm wondering what the challenges were and the learnings you have for how to make that work well.
How to balance the two?
Right. I mean, in a context like that where there's a mixture, there's
Yeah.
got to be some challenges that
Yeah,
occur.
that's
and
great.
what learnings are there for us
So
to
the question is
understand?
how to balance systems leadership and top-down leadership, and that's a great observation. And in fact, that I think I can say that was true through everything we did in every country. It was a blend of really committed and dynamic top-down leadership in the context of a broader group effort. So often those top-down leaders could get the process started by giving a mandate or making a commitment, or using their credibility to mobilize others. And then often you would have quite a crowd of very effective top-down leaders working together in a group. So I think the two are actually complementary and can help accelerate each other.
Okay, last one.
Last one.
Do you have strategies to try to shift people's behavior towards more sustainable diets? Because we've seen that consumer is at the center of the demand, right?
Yes.
And if they don't want plant-based proteins, then we have
Yeah.
a problem.
Yeah. So the question is, how do we shift consumer behavior in a more sustainable direction? And that's a great question. We ourselves didn't directly work on that, but I think that's probably one of the really high priorities for the whole next phase of where this needs to go, and particularly in high growth markets. Where there's a lot of new consumers who are trying new products, adopting new habits, having more and more buying power. Getting in early to sort of create a certain set of preferences or values among those consumers is really important.